Programa Interdisciplinario de Políticas y Prácticas Educativas del CIDE, y les doy la más cordial bienvenida. Antes de darle la palabra a nuestras invitadas, estamos muy emocionados de que estén el día de hoy aquí. Voy a dar una breve introducción al seminario y luego ya podemos comenzar la discusión. Pero bueno, entonces voy a presentar a nuestras dos ponentes invitadas, son invitadas de lujo. Las voy a presentar en español y esta introducción la voy a hacer en español porque ellas hablan muy bien español. Tenemos el día de hoy con nosotros a Dana Bird, lo pronuncio Bird, ya había pedido esa aclaración y se me olvidó. Ella es profesora en Educación Internacional en la Escuela Steinhardt, en NYU, y es autora del libro Schools for Conflict and for Peace in Afghanistan. Y Elizabeth King también es profesora en la misma universidad, profesora de Educación Internacional, y es autora del libro From Classroom to Conflict in Rwanda. Y bueno, en los dos casos, esto es una obra entre muchísima obra que han escrito sobre el problema que nos convoca hoy, que es el problema de la relación entre la educación y la violencia. Nos pareció aquí en el PIPE que era muy importante contribuir a este debate que se está inaugurando en estos meses sobre violencia y sobre pacificación, ¿no? Sobre construcción de paz. No necesito decirles que México está inmerso en una crisis de seguridad tremenda con enormes costos humanos y que bueno, por muchas razones, pero entre otras por una mala política de combate al tráfico de drogas. Y creo que todos estamos un poco esperanzados con la nueva administración, ¿no? Que ha hecho parte de su agenda central la construcción de paz, ¿no? Digo, la nueva administración prometió, y esperemos que cumpla, ¿no? Implementar una serie de medidas que tienen que ver con cambiar el diseño cambiar la estrategia de combate al narcotráfico y con implementar medidas de justicia transicional que tienen que ver con establecer comisiones de la verdad, con programas de desmovilización, amnistías, etcétera, etcétera. Entonces, hay una gran expectativa de construcción de paz en este país, pero nosotros creemos que el tema de la educación se ha quedado un poco de lado, ¿no? Y esto es, digamos, entre paréntesis, es muy común en muchos lugares no es propio de México. En muchos lugares en el mundo, cuando se piensa en la construcción de paz, creo que la educación es lo último que como que queda relegado al último plano, como si fuera una consideración secundaria. Y bueno, evidentemente quienes estamos interesados en el tema educativo creemos que no es así, que de hecho la educación tiene un papel central en estos temas, y ese es un poco el motivo de convocar a este seminario. Y un poco creo que el punto central es entender que la relación entre la violencia y la educación es complejo, ¿no? Creo que la educación y la construcción de paz pueden interactuar de muchas maneras, y creo que ese va a ser el tema central de las ponencias el día de hoy. Pueden tener una relación positiva o negativa, quiero decir, la educación y la paz pueden interactuar de miles de maneras, insisto, positivas o negativas, y bueno, creo que eso tiene que ser el tema que se discuta aquí y que en adelante debemos tener, ¿no? Entonces, bueno, eso es una pequeña introducción, y ya sin mayores preámbulos le voy a pasar la palabra a Elizabeth King primero. Gracias.
Buenos días. Muchas gracias por la invitación de venir aquí a hablar con ustedes de la educación, de la violencia y la paz. Voy a hablar en inglés, pero también quiero decir gracias a ustedes. Entonces, today I'm going to be talking about education, schooling. And that's something, of course, with which we're all familiar in some way. Many of us are researchers, students, teachers. But of course, this is not only an important topic for those of us that are gathered in this room today. This next photo I took in Nyamata, Rwanda, in the Bugesera region, which was very hard hit by the genocide. And it's in a church where during the genocide, people gathered in the hopes of finding refuge and safety. And about 10,000 people gathered there together, and they locked themselves in. And rather than finding safety in this church, there was a massacre. And today, the bones of 50,000 people are interred in this church. And they left their belongings as a memorial exactly where they fell. And if you look carefully at this picture, what strikes me, when people were fleeing their homes and taking only the most essential with them, people took school books and report cards. This next photo is also really the starting point for the talk today. This is a road sign in Liberia, in Monrovia, that says, "So many good things happen in school. Go to school." And that's also what I tell my 7-year-old when she doesn't want to go to school in the morning. But this is our conventional wisdom and our starting point for this conversation today, that education, at least in the context of peace and conflict, can help bridge divisions and build peace. And that's the way that you talked about this seminar today, La Educación como Herramienta de Pacificación. So this is part of the story that I'll tell today, but I'll also very much aim to nuance this picture and talk about the multiple relationships between education and conflict. This is a photo that I took at a school in Kenya, and a plan of what I hope to do with my moments with you this morning. First, I'd like to tell you a little bit more about the research that I conducted in Rwanda. I'm going to be talking about education in the sense of formal schooling led by the state. And when I say conflict, I'm using this as a shorthand for violent conflict. I'm going to talk about 4 key relationships between education and conflict that emerged from the research that I conducted in Rwanda. But you'll see that they're not by any means unique to Rwanda. My good colleague and friend Dana Birdie found these same relationships to be evident in her tremendous work in Afghanistan. And over the past 15 years, as I've been working on these topics, I've seen these relationships replicated in multiple states. I'm also going to talk through some of the implications, and this is where I hope that we'll extend the implications beyond what they might be in Rwanda to also think about what they might be here in Mexico. And you are going to know so much more about this than I, and I'm looking forward to our conversation where you can talk to us about if and how you see these relationships on the ground here. And indeed, when I talk about this research in diverse places, people typically come up to me after the talk from places like Afghanistan and Israel and Kenya, where I work a lot today, in the United States or in Canada, my home country, and talk to me about how these different relationships resonate with their own individual schooling experiences. And I hope that you might see some of that as well. And we'll certainly come back, and I'll look forward to your thoughts at the end of the talk. So first, telling you a little bit about the research that I conducted in Rwanda. This is a photo that I took in a school in northern Rwanda. These girls had just won their regional basketball championship. Rwanda, as you might know, is one of the poorest states in the world. It's 29th from the bottom of the Human Development Index. Nearly 60% of the population live below what's already a very low poverty line. And of course, you know that Rwanda has the unfortunate distinction of being best known internationally as the site of the genocide that left perhaps 800,000 people dead in 1994. Probably upwards of 500,000 ethnic Tutsis, but also many moderate Hutus were killed as well. Killing took place along lines that are tremendously difficult to comprehend. Families were torn apart along victim-perpetrator lines, communities. And I met with several students and teachers who also had the genocide tear apart their relationships. One teacher in particular told me that he quit teaching after his students had tried to kill him during the genocide. While there was widespread participation in the genocide, there's estimated 14 to 17% of the adult male Hutu population that participated in killing. It was led by a specific group of Hutu hardliners who wanted to maintain power. The genocide ended through the military victory of a Tutsi minority-dominated Rwandan Patriotic Front who came from Uganda and put an end to the genocide, and that RPF, Rwandan Patriotic Front, remains the government to this day. So giving you that little bit of background to make sure we're all on the same page in order to interpret what I'm going to talk to you about in terms of education, despite this poverty and this history of violence, Rwanda has often stood out as a model developing country, and education often comes to the forefront in those conversations. For instance, Rwanda has expanded its primary education greatly, and even by 1990, before the genocide, it had achieved gender parity in primary schools. At the same time, what you'll see today is that education is a very complicated issue in Rwanda, where this is a state characterized by competition for access to resources along ethnic lines, along regional lines, along class lines, and education has been one of the key sites of this competition. So today, what I'm telling you reflects upon qualitative field research that I did in Rwanda, talking to people who had been students and teachers at various periods in Rwanda's past, from the colonial period until really the mid-2000s, speaking with educational experts and government officials, and also a deep investigation of archival material and curricular material in order to investigate these emerging relationships about education and conflict. And the examples that you'll see that I draw on come from over 100 one-on-one interviews with students and teachers. So I'm talking today primarily from my book that Juan kindly mentioned at the beginning, and also a shorter article that lays out these relationships that I shared with our discussants today, and I'm happy to share more broadly to the extent it might be of interest to you. So in talking about these four relationships between education and conflict, oh, you're one slide behind. Between education and conflict, what I want to highlight for those that think about it in these terms is that both of these terms serve as independent and dependent variable. That is, sometimes it's education that's driving the relationship, and sometimes it's conflict that's driving the relationship. I also want to highlight that we see both education playing a positive role and a negative role in society. We see that some of these roles are very clearly intended, and some of them may not be intended. And what we also see is that education can play multiple roles simultaneously. So I had to impose an order on these relationships for the purpose of a presentation, but we shouldn't think about them linearly or that they go in this order necessarily. I think in imposing the order upon them, I thought about them perhaps as most accepted to least accepted. So what's most intuitive to us to least intuitive to us. What you'll see, though, also is that there are tremendous gaps in our knowledge and our research across all of these relationships. Oops, sorry. Now, as we move into these relationships, I wanted to think about if and how Mexico fits into this, which is far beyond my realm of expertise. The places where I work are typically considered violent conflict or post-conflict. But Mexico also fits into this picture, I think, in some ways, if we reflect upon this graphic that comes from Joshua Goldstein's book, Winning the War on War. And what this figure shows, although it's a few years old now, is that the death toll from drug-related violence in Mexico exceeds the number of people killed per year in some of the countries that are worst affected by violent conflict in our classic definition. And so I present this just for you to think about the diversity of contexts in which some of these relationships might play out. The first relationship that I'll talk about of the four, the most intuitive, is that violent conflict can disrupt education. And when people talk about education and conflict, this is one of the two most typical relationships that they highlight. The dominant trend, really, I'd say, in the education and in the conflict literature. So according to recent figures provided by UNICEF, there are an estimated 27 million children who are out of school in conflict zones today. If we think about refugees in particular, only about 50% of refugee children are in primary schools, and only about 25% of refugee youth are enrolled in secondary schools. So this acknowledgement that violent conflict disrupts education goes back quite some time, but to really a seminal report by Graça Machel in 1996, highlighting the ways in which violent conflict leaves youth and children with deep and lasting scars, and talks about a lost generation due to conflict. More recently, if we look at the literature that monitors global education, the 2011 Education for All Global Monitoring Report was called The Hidden Crisis, Armed Conflict and Education, and focused on the damaging consequences of conflict for the Education for All goals, which were embedded in the Millennium Development Goals and also the Sustainable Development Goals. Here I show you one figure of data from sub-Saharan Africa. I'm working on a report with two of our excellent doctoral students, Emily Dunlop and Joe Kelsey, and also a colleague at the University of Nairobi, Caroline Ndirangu, that's looking at access to secondary education for people in sub-Saharan African contexts that are conflict affected or recently post-conflict. And I think what this figure tells us is that both at the lower secondary level and at the upper secondary level, access to secondary school for those who are in conflict-affected states is systematically lower, and even with such a small sample size, statistically significantly lower. We can't say for sure that this is because of conflict, but we clearly see these lower trends in net enrollment rates in conflict-affected and non-conflict-affected countries. This is also a relationship that emerged spontaneously in the multitude of conversations that I was privileged to have with Rwandans. In Rwanda, the civil war and genocide impacted the school system in many ways, and the legacy of that conflict remains to this day. So the last normal year of schooling in Rwanda prior to the 1994 genocide was 1990. And then the Ministry of Education completely closed in 1994. So there was certainly a period of schooling that was lost for this generation of students. And when schools reopened, the experiences and the consequences of conflict continued to disrupt the educational experience and trajectory of Rwandan children. For example, much of the educational infrastructure was destroyed during the war and the genocide. 65% of schools were damaged. And 75% of teachers were killed, fled the country, or imprisoned on genocide charges. So you can imagine the enormity of the reconstruction effort on the education system. Many talk about Rwandans in the aftermath of the genocide, and Rwandan children in particular, as a deeply traumatized population. One study by UNICEF found, for instance, that 80% of the children that they interviewed had experienced a death in their family. 91% thought they would die. 36% saw other children participating in violence. And unimaginably, 16% had at some point hidden under dead bodies. Orphanhood is another serious consequence that has plagued Rwanda's school system. More than 1.2 million children were left orphaned after the genocide, representing some 16% of the entire population, or nearly 1/3 of all children. And there is a strong legacy of fear that permeates classrooms in the post-genocide period. Tutsi students being scared of Hutu teachers, for instance. The ways in which conflict disrupts education are not only relevant for Rwanda, this is undoubtedly a crucial global focus, and these examples from my work in Rwanda hopefully illuminate that to you. And this is also, as I said, probably the most accepted dominant way that we think about education and conflict when we think about those two terms in the same sentence. The second relationship that I think is the second and most frequently articulated relationship between education and conflict is that education can help prevent violent conflict and or that it can help build peace. So this flips the relationship from education as the dependent or the outcome variable to here education being the independent or the input variable for those of you who think in those terms. So indeed, besides education being a crucial human right, crucial to sustainable development, there's also an overwhelmingly common belief that education contributes to peace. So this is often quoted if you search NGOs, for instance, worldwide. Nelson Mandela has called education the most powerful weapon to change the world. I visited the main genocide memorial in Rwanda, the Museum Gisozi in Kigali, and the very last panel at the end of the museum says, "Education has become our way forward." When Dana Birdie and I were first getting to know each other 10 years ago, we attended a UN General Assembly special session on education in conflict-affected context. And I'm sure you remember the representative from Iraq stood up and said, "A lack of education is a more deadly weapon than the most destructive arms." So this is also characterized, bless you, in the literature on education and conflict. So there are a number of studies that show us how young, uneducated populations with a lack of opportunities contribute to conflict. A lot of this literature comes out of places like Sierra Leone or Liberia, where this first study I referenced, Humphreys and Weinstein, comes from. What they found that was among youth in Sierra Leone, those without access to education were 9 times more likely to become rebels than those who had gone to school. Probably the most often study is the one by Collier and Hoffler that looks at strong correlations between male secondary school enrollment and reduced likelihood of civil war. And this is via the mechanism of heightened opportunity costs. So with the argument that those with an education have more to lose if they were to involve themselves in violent conflict. And what they find is that each year of education at the secondary level for boys reduces a country's risk of conflict by 20%. This is frequently cited. Oyefuze's study in Nigeria, which I note here too, he discovered that moving from no education to completion of primary education or from completion of primary education to completion of secondary education reduced the likelihood of willingness to join a rebel group by 36%. So this is not the only mechanism, but I highlight opportunity costs because it comes back in the second presentation where Dana will talk about our current study. But some of these other mechanisms are also frequently invoked in thinking about how education can help stem violent conflict and help build peace. One of them might be that the provision of education can signal to a population that they're important to them, can be a peace dividend, making a commitment to the population. We also often hear about the skills that can be taught in schools that could help prevent conflict and build peace. For instance, conflict resolution skills. Schools can also, we talked at dinner last night, help students find normalcy and routine in an otherwise unpredictable context and are talked about as a place where students can cope and hope. Hope too, I highlight here because that comes back in the next presentation. Reflecting upon Juan Espinoza's important work on this subject, we could also think about how education might become part of a transitional justice endeavor. And that's something that we can certainly talk more about in the Mexican context. But what I want to underscore is that there is a lack of rigorous evidence on nearly all of these relationships. So they're widely believed and often repeated, but the rigor and the quantity of the studies that we have that speak to these relationships is still very few. And so for anyone looking for a dissertation topic, like this is a very fruitful slide. What I want to do now, though, is just highlight that Dana Birdie has done with our doctoral students some excellent work reviewing the state of the literature on this. And so I actually want to invite her to speak to just one slide of some of the key findings that have to do with quality and well-being and what we do know. Oh, here, someone was taking a photo so that they can read your studies after. And then I'll go to the next one. So Dana, do you want to say a few words about what you found on quality and well-being?
I feel like this is the commercial break or something. So a couple of points to underscore some of the key points that Elizabeth has made. There is very little research in the sense that we would describe as the most rigorous to measure cause and effect relationships. There's a lot of research that is observational. Some of it is quite strong. But what we are most interested in understanding, particularly in programs that have questions that address applied and policy relevant outcomes, are how do these programs actually work? And on that score, the data is scarce. I will underscore some of the points that we do know, or the areas in which I think there is more promising evidence. There's been a lot of research on peace education. I would say in general that research needs a lot more work, but it does seem that contact between groups shows promise. There is also recent studies, there are recent studies that examine just that premise, the contact hypothesis, and I would highly recommend looking into the contact hypothesis further if you're interested. There are promising observational studies that show equal education access, greater national levels of educational attainment may limit participation in militancy or extremism. These results are mixed. There is really at this point no robust evidence on how education may prevent what people refer to in my country, in your Elizabeth's adopted country, my country, as violent extremism. That term, I think, is very problematic. I won't go into details about it now, other than to footnote the problematic nature of this phrase, actually countering violent extremism or preventing violent extremism. There is strong evidence. There's some very good evidence on measures of well-being for children living in conflict-affected countries and conflict-affected circumstances and very stressful circumstances. That comes out of applied psychology literature primarily, and some of that looks at how creative play, therapies work, arts programs, and that seems to indicate that provision of these extra services to some of the most vulnerable does improve well-being. That said, people react differently to different types of programs, and there does seem to be some indication that programs that focus on trauma and isolate trauma as a negative aspect of people's experiences seems to be less effective than focusing on daily stressors, which communities deal with quite broadly. So the trauma model is one that's designed to focus on a small minority of students in countries that are typically more stable and regions that are more stable. The daily stressors addresses a wider range of experiences in a population. Finally, there is emerging evidence that for the majority of conflict or disaster-affected children and youth, school routines do seem to improve mental health and resilience. Resilience is a slippery concept, but resilience usually refers to the ability to adapt and cope more effectively under adverse circumstances. I'm going to turn it back over to Elizabeth. Thank you.
Thanks. So you can see we're so fortunate that we're in the same place at the same institution and can engage in such collaborative work, which we also understand you at CDE are very eager to collaborate with each other and maybe even with us after we see what commonalities there are in our interests. I wanted to just make sure on this second relationship that Dana elaborated on for us in thinking about the ways in which education can help prevent violent conflict and builds peace, that this is also a relationship that I very much saw in Rwanda and that you can see espoused in the quote that I've highlighted. So in Rwanda's national policies, education is assigned a very important role in promoting unity and reconciliation. Peace education is an important part of the post-genocide curriculum. In theory, it's thought that this type of education can help bridge certain types of divisions through, for instance, the way that social studies or the historical narrative is taught, enabling students to think about a shared future. It could also help students grapple with the past. And this is that transitional justice lens that I understand the New Mexican leadership has some interest in. And in speaking to the mechanisms that Dana just highlighted, also that they could model peace education through equitable access to schools, through pedagogy, through school-based practices. They've also talked in Rwanda schools about an effort to engage in critical thinking and to helping youth work through conflicts. And what I'll underscore here is that none of this is necessarily how schools work. So if we wanted to talk in the question period about contemporary Rwanda, what we would see is that the presence of these things actually materializing on the ground is very limited. So it is, in my view, and what I write about in the book, is that the practices on the ground really contradict what we hear being the narrative and the goals of the education system. Moving on to the third of the four relationships that I wanted to highlight to you this morning, schools can be sites of violence. And again, I'm moving towards the relationships being less and less accepted and well known. But we have, in the past decade, come to learn a lot more about the ways in which schools themselves can be sites of attack, and preliminarily about what might be done to limit this. And again, Dana's work here is very informative. There's a United Nations resolution from 2011 that recognizes schools as safe havens for children, and it calls on parties that attack such facilities to be held accountable. The Global Coalition to Protect Education from Attack, GCIPIA, some of our excellent former doctoral students work there now. They study the trends and they inform the international community about attacks on education, and they advocate against attacks on education. And they report that from 2013 to 2017, there were upwards of 12,700 attacks on education in more than 70 countries. And of course, schools are also sites of a multitude of other forms of violence that we won't go into as much detail this morning. But of course, in my work, I think about the sexual violence that is prevalent in schools in many of the countries where I've had the chance to work. I wanted to show you this map that comes from GCIPIA, the Global Coalition to Protect Education from Attack. It's a little bit old, it comes from 2014, but what I wanted to highlight to you is that Mexico is one of the 30 countries that it identifies as being a place where attacks on education have happened. And here this is from the 2009 to the 2012 period. And perhaps you could teach us more about this, but what they say in their report is that teachers in more than 75 schools were threatened. More than 50 students, teachers, academics, and education officials were killed or abducted. And that's why Mexico comes onto this global picture and speaks to some of the things we were also talking about last night. In Rwanda, too, in the interviews that I conducted, schools as a site of violence emerged and complicate this relationship between education and conflict. So before the genocide in Rwanda, before some of the schools closed, students of different ethnic groups reported experiencing systematic harassment that made them feel like schools were an unsafe place. This is the Tutsi minority in particular. During the Rwandan genocide, I opened with a photo of a slide that shows you how people congregated in churches, but people often congregated in schools as well and looked to them as safe spaces. And there is one school in construction at that time where 40,000 people were massacred. And also in the aftermath of the genocide, there were killings in schools by insurgents who were based in the Congo and crossed back over the border into Rwanda. Now, perhaps even more complicated, I had the chance to conduct interviews with 4 people who were imprisoned in the main prison in Kigali on charges of genocide. And these were people who had been formerly teachers. And I remember one interview in particular, a man who struck me by his eloquence in the way that he talked about education, and yet he was in prison on Class 1 genocide crimes. And while professing his innocence, it's very unlikely that he was innocent. We know that a number of teachers were génocidaires. And how do we think about teachers as peace builders at the same breath that we have to think about them as having perpetrated violence in this country? Because schools had become sites of violence, many parents were scared to send their children to school after the genocide. Now, the fourth relationship that I want to talk to you about today, and this is perhaps the relationship that's most difficult to talk about for scholars and practitioners of education who believe in the power and the promise of education. And also, given we're so often fighting for support and more resources for an under-resourced education system, it's hard for us to grapple with the ways in which education can and does contribute to underlying conflict. So this is the central theme of the book that Juan told you a little bit about, From Classrooms to Conflict in Rwanda, underscoring the fact that as much as we hope and as much as we believe and as much as if we work as if schools necessarily contribute to peace, there are lots of ways in which schools and what happens in schools can contribute to underlying conflict. So it's not necessarily the case that education contributes to peace. And I think we also often think about schools as neutral places or as potentially apolitical, but these are deeply political, non-neutral spaces. So in my work, I investigate how education contributes to underlying conflict by thinking about education and schooling in 2 dimensions. So one, the structure of schooling. So who has access to schools? How schools are set up, and also the content of schooling. And in my work, I focus principally on the historical narrative and the history curriculum of what makes it into the narrative and what doesn't make it into the narrative. And in the case of Rwanda, we see over a long swath of history, depending on the group in power, the other group being systematically excluded from educational opportunities. And we see likewise important shifts in the historical narrative that place privilege and blame on one group or the other. And talking to youth so often how that historical narrative is brought into the present, as if that explains the contemporary situation. Now, Dana Birdie's work that Juan also mentioned in her book on similar topics in Afghanistan reminds us that while we like to think that this is a problem of national governments, and of course that when international aid comes into the equation, that this wouldn't be something that happens there, she shows us and disabuses us of this notion. So for example, one of the most fascinating parts of her book shows us that from 1986 to 1992, for example, US aid to Afghan refugees in Pakistan supported the development of pro-Mujahideen textbooks, which were designed to indoctrinate Afghan children to fight against the Soviet occupiers. Now, she could talk about this, of course, in much more eloquence and detail than I can, but these books included lessons like J is for jihad, K is for Kalashnikov, as well as math problems that used bullets for counting. We could both give you a host more of examples if you wanted to continue that conversation. But for now, what I want to do is bring us to the implications. So where do we end up after we recognize that there are these 4, and at least 4, complex, diverse, interacting relationships between education and conflict. So all of these relationships emerged spontaneously from interviewees, students, and teachers in Rwanda, that there are multiple things going on here at once. So the outcomes that we hope for from education are far from guaranteed. These relationships, as I mentioned, are not mutually exclusive. An education system can and often is doing multiple things at the same time. And we would urge, as part of our research agenda, that there is much scope and need for further study in this area. And it seems like CIDE is very well positioned at the cusp of new initiatives from the Mexican government to be a part of meaningfully moving forward this research agenda. I would argue that this is also a really important time to learn more about this globally as well, not least because of global demographics. So in sub-Saharan Africa, where I work most, 43% of the population is under the age of 15. 43% of the population. Within 5 years, it is projected that there will be 57 million more 15 to 24-year-olds in Arab states, South and West Asia, and sub-Saharan Africa. 57 million more youth. We know that there are perhaps 27 million youth in conflict-affected countries who are currently out of schools. And we also know that there's such a global push to get more youth into schools. So if there's a time to be thinking about what schools are doing, what the structure of schools is, what the content of schools is, I would urge that that moment is now, where schooling is expanding and our youth population is expanding. And there's also such opportunity. I also wanted to make the point that schooling is, I think, an important microcosm of society. So in the ways that I've talked about it today, we can think about the structure and the content of school as reflecting how those in power understand entitlement to the state, how they understand history, how they understand peace building and efforts towards it. At the same time, though, it's not just that schooling mirrors and reflects a government system, but it's also that schools, so not passive reflectors, but actively shape politics and intergroup relations. I think this is well shown in the Rwandan case and some of the examples also that I've highlighted today. And I think that this reflector, mirror, but also active shaper is also a reality that the Mexican government is going to have to think about very carefully. So it's with that I'm going to leave you with this last slide, and I'm going to quote Ernest Gellner, right, who we all as political scientists have studied and read, who was speaking to the importance of the socializing role of schools. And he said back in 1983 that the monopoly on legitimate education is now more important and more central than is the monopoly of legitimate violence, right? Turning around what we typically think about the definition of the state. And so I'd urge us to end at that point, at least for my portion of the talk, thinking about education in all of its complexity. I'm grateful for your attention and for your attendance this morning, for the invitation to be here, la primera vez en la Ciudad de Mexico, and I'll really look forward to the conversation that I hope that this starts afterwards. Thank you. Thank you. And we go straight to Dana. Excellent.
Okay, well, so much fun to listen to a colleague give a presentation. I just enjoy it so much because we don't often do that, right? When you're working so closely together, we sometimes present. We occasionally, actually, I guess we do present together once a year, maybe or so. But it's always really exciting because you get to see where our work is going and how far it's come. So thank you. Bueno, voy a decir también como Elizabeth, voy a decir muchísimas gracias por invitarnos y lo siento que no puedo decir todo en español, pero me encanta estar aquí y fue también tan interesante anoche hablar sobre todos los preguntas que tienen aquí sobre educación y la violencia. And now I'll speak in English. So I will talk today about a new project, in fact, our current project, as well as data from the first iteration of the study in Karachi, Nairobi, that Elizabeth and I are working on now with 2 other colleagues. The data I will speak about today is specifically from our first step to gather qualitative data from youth across Nairobi and Karachi. We're calling this paper An Agenda for Hope, Pathways from Education to Hope and Peace Among Youth in Nairobi and Karachi. This is the first time I'm presenting this paper, and we welcome all kinds of feedback on it. It's a work in progress, and we hope to leave here today with some excellent new ideas for ways to make the paper stronger. So please feel free to let us know. The motivations for this paper, and really the full study, has come from aspects that Elizabeth just pointed out in her excellent presentation, that from real-world questions that relate to many countries facing unprecedented youthful populations, as we just heard. These same countries experience enormous amounts of political violence. International organizations and NGOs try to turn the peril of youth. Oh, I just realized I haven't been changing the slides on the projector for you to see. I should click. And if I do it here, is that just as good? Okay. This is what I'm speaking to at the moment. And international organizations and indeed national governments are interested in turning the peril of youth into the promise of youth. These youth bulges, as people refer to them, should also be seen, many people argue, as youth as resources for states who need to rely on their populations to move them forward, both intellectually and economically. Education is considered a key vehicle to create hope among youth, to steer them away from participating in violence. So this is the relationship that we focus on in this paper, the relationship between education and hope, how education affects hope, influences hope, I'll say, because we're relying on qualitative data for this paper. The dominant discourse that we see in world leaders, I reflect here, one from the current Secretary General of the UN, Antonio Guterres, and the other from President Obama. And I find these quotes really powerful. I have to say, I particularly find the Obama quote powerful in light of our current circumstances in the United States. So I am going to read it to you because it's such a juxtaposition to the current environment in the U.S. Obama said in 2014, "We have not confronted forcefully enough the intolerance, sectarianism, and hopelessness that feeds violent extremism in too many parts of the globe. For America," this is the part that I particularly appreciate, "the choice is clear. We choose hope over fear. We see the future not as something out of our control, but something we can shape for the better through concerted and collective effort." Very inspiring words. Both of these leaders invoke hope, and yet, as we'll see, we don't really know that much. We know very little, in fact, about the relationships that they identify in their messages. In the literature, there is a growing interest, as Elizabeth described, in youth, in political science, in international education, and other disciplines. There's also a correlation that's been identified between large youthful populations and political violence. I think Elizabeth outlined these quite well just now. Education also is assumed to reduce the likelihood of conflict. It has actually been shown in some cases to reduce the likelihood of conflict. Yet, despite the prevalence of programs that motivate these relationships, programs that fund these relationships, programs that are structured to promote education, to fund these relationships, scant empirical research investigates the pathways from education to hope or the obstacles that may disrupt these relationships. So we ask, Elizabeth and I ask in this paper, what do we really know about hope? How can it be cultivated among youth? And how does education fit in? We note that these assertions regarding this relationship between education and hope are actually too simplistic. And so we would like to, in this paper, analyze systematically the relationships between education and hope to present a more nuanced understanding, to delineate pathways through which education may promote hope or be blocked, thus, in some cases, even contributing to dashed hopes. We also want to investigate this dashed hopes, this aspect of education dashing hopes a little bit further, which I'll do later in the talk. So what I will present from our paper is a brief discussion of the background, the framework, the methods that we used, our findings. I'm going to illustrate our findings. As I mentioned, this is qualitative data. This paper is based on qualitative data collected in both cities, Nairobi and Karachi. And I will talk about our findings in the context of the youth's voices. I'm going to actually read some of the things that they said to us, to you. We'll discuss this, then I'll leave you with some of our conclusions, and I'll also elaborate on our current study a little bit that Elizabeth and I can both speak. We can both speak to all of these questions, of course, during the Q&A. Excuse me. So Nairobi, why Nairobi, Kenya, and Karachi, Pakistan? Why? Why would we choose these two seemingly dramatically different places in dramatically different parts of the world? What would be similar, possibly similar, or different in these places? We can think of many of the differences. We don't often think of the similarities. Here are some that we want to draw your attention to. Both of these countries and cities experience a prevalence of violence. Both manage various forms of violence that include ethnic, gang-related, nationalist, religious, and terrorist. And youth are often blamed for these violent episodes in both societies. The median age of youth is similar. Kenya is around 19 years old. Pakistan is around 21 years old, 22 years old. Both have these enormous youth bulges that Elizabeth referred to in dramatic numbers a few minutes ago. Education is proposed as a remedy to youth violence in both countries and both cities. They are both critical to stability in their regions. I think this is also really interesting. They both deal with many of the same cross-border issues we've discovered as we've been working on these two countries together in the past several years. Pakistan, of course, managing conflicts across the border with Afghanistan and being implicated in certain ways, and Kenya, of course, managing conflicts across the border with Somalia and also having challenges of intervention implication. And both countries deal with consequences of those conflicts on their borders. They are ranked similarly on the Human Development Index, although I've been kind of a little bit dismayed to see that both have moved down in their ratings on the Development Index since we started this project together. They used to be ranked 124th for Pakistan and 125th for Kenya, and now Kenya is ranked 142nd, Pakistan is 150th. Interesting to see that shift. The language of hope is invoked by national and international actors alike in both places. So, returning to our question, what is hope? How might education influence it? What do we know about hope? In the literature, we see two dimensions of hope, and these are the two dimensions that we try to get at, try to understand and disaggregate in our work. it's seen as both a goal-setting framework and an emotion that is difficult to control, that is non-rational, that motivates behavior. Both aspects are prevalent in the literature about hope, and they stem from Snyder, who was instrumental in studying hope in the early 90s, in fact, mid-80s, early 90s, and other scholars who have studied the ways in which these two elements interact. We identify three key relationships between education and hope in the literature. Number one, people talk about the effects of hope on educational outcomes. This is probably the most well-researched. None of these relationships, I would say, are particularly well-researched, but among the three, this one returns the most studies. There's been the most focus on this relationship. The second relationship we see in the literature is education itself as a hope, and there is not a lot written about this, very little, I would say. The third is the one that we think is of most interest, particularly in our work, and that is the effects of education on hope, as I mentioned. The empirical studies of these effects are rare, and when you think about the empirical studies of effects of relationships between education and hope, outside of the Western context, outside of the English-speaking world, they're virtually non-existent. That includes measures of hope. We have measures of hope that relate to English-speaking populations, primarily the US, Western Europe. We don't have those measures for many other parts of the world. We don't know what are the similarities and differences in these measures. I want to draw your attention also to the emphasis in which that people place on hope themselves. So returning to that second relationship, education itself as a hope. The UN did a survey around the world, a global survey. It's called the UN My World Survey. And it asked people to rank 16 essential needs from a list that included education, jobs, health, affordable food, and more, healthcare, excuse me. This survey showed that people in both the global north and the global south place hope in education, ranking it first in the My World survey. I think that's striking, telling. So our methods for this particular paper. Now, to remind you, this is the first stage of a multi-year study on education and hope. And I'll bring you up to date by the end of the talk on where we are in the study, in the multi-year study. So for this portion of the study, we were interested in understanding better, what do you think? How do youth perceive education and hope and aspirations, and what are youth lives like? What are their trajectories? We conducted qualitative, semi-structured interviews in depth with 40 in-school and out-of-school youth. Excuse me. I'm recovering from a cold and cough just lingers. So we conducted interviews with a total of 160 youth across both cities. Among out-of-school youth, about one-third, among our sample of out-of-school youth, about one-third had dropped out after primary school, one-third had completed a few years of secondary, and one-third had dropped out, had stopped after secondary and had no plans to return, or weren't able, had no prospects to return, as they reported to us. Half of the sample was boys, half was girls. The ones who were in school were in their last year of secondary school. The ones who were out of school were approximately the same age. We also tried to mirror geographic regions. These samples were also ethnically diverse to try to capture a range of ethnicities across both settings. Our questions asked about education, aspirations, hopes for the future, views of peace, recommendations for education, and youth, views on youth as well. Our findings. We found, as is echoed in our world leaders' quotes that I highlighted in the outset of the talk, we found that youth also believe in multiple positive relationships between education and hope. In our interviews, they spoke about education and hope in predominantly 3 ways: as an embodiment of hope to which youth aspire, as something that is instrumental to other hopes. Education must be used to, one must have an education in order to realize other hopes in one's life, and education itself as a cultivator of hope. Education as an embodiment of hope. Youth told us, for example, that they hope to get an education, they hope to get a higher education, university for school, for youth who are already in school, or a return to school for many out-of-school youth, even though they also had the sense that this was beyond their reach in many cases. To reflect youth voices, I will read you some of the things they told us, which I think are very important. Out-of-school youth in Nairobi, one out-of-school youth in Nairobi notes that she would like to leave her job and go back to school, explaining, and the interviewer prompted her, why would you want to leave your job? You're earning money. And she said, because I just want to go to school. That's what I've been wanting to do, to go to school and not to job, even if it's 100 million Kenyan shillings that they are paying. Extremely motivated. Youth talked about this relationship as education that is instrumental to other hopes. And please bear in mind that I'm just selecting quotes. We have many, of course, and we put many more in the paper. I want to make sure we have opportunity to get to all the questions and discussion that is very important to us today. Always important to us, and particularly important to us now. So I will make sure to just read you choice pieces. Youth discussed education as a key stepping stone to the futures that they imagined. For example, a young woman in Karachi says, those who belong to educated families, their conditions are good. They have manners due to which they get good jobs. They have been working, they have the confidence to speak to others, and they get good jobs. When they get good jobs, this makes their conditions better in comparison to those who wander or do not work. Education as a cultivator of hope. Many youth talk about the power they believe education holds. And for example, one boy in Nairobi said, I think school is where people study, change their behavior, and also achieve their dreams. School is a place where people dream. A girl in Nairobi explained, for me, the experience is that in school, that is where I learned that now, after education, there is a life ahead. That is where I know now that there's life ahead, and after school, I can do this. Youth described education giving them confidence to achieve their goals. We also did hear a lot about the negative relationships between education and hope from youth. Having said that, though, I do want to emphasize that even the negative relationships were couched in terms of, I wish I had education. This is really important to underscore. Youth raised negative relationships between education and hope, specifically 3 things: inequality, exclusion. I would say not just inequality, inequity was really the point they were making, inequity. Exclusion and corruption. Some described the magnifying effect that education has on these 3 aspects, these 3 negative experiences of exclusion, inequity, and corruption. A young woman, for example, in Karachi notes, my friends who used to study with me have completed their 2nd year of high school, and now they're studying in university. They don't talk to me properly now. We are poor and uneducated. That is why we have no respect in society. No one greets us. We have to bow down to everyone. And they think that they own us, and the whole society looks down on us. that also reflects the enormous burden of the social hierarchy that youth in Karachi feel and experience, which is true to some extent in Kenya as well. This social hierarchy that education can help them move up through and out of. They talked, especially in Karachi, extensively about corruption. They also discussed corruption in Nairobi as well, and how this corruption has an effect on hope, that their hopes were dashed. And this is not their, they didn't say to us, our hope, they're dashed, but they exhibited such angst and fear and sometimes desperation in their interviews. This is what we see. One boy notes in Kenya, the Kenya of today is characterized by tribalism and discrimination. And tribalism and discrimination were highlighted in the Kenyan interviews extensively, that one needs connections to move forward. He says, so the connections matter more than the education. A girl notes similarly, you can have a degree, but you're not working in a construction site because you don't get the opportunity to work in X construction site because you do not have connections to go, or you don't have the money to bribe those people to get a job there. She takes these observations a step further, noting that teachers just tell you, this life is hard. You have to read hard, but me, I don't see the need because you can read hard, you can get an A, and you can come after Form 4, and if your parents don't have the money, you will just be like the one who got E. You will be the same, whether you get an A or an E. The final negative relationship that I'm going to highlight, underscore, comes from a youth in Karachi and illustrates the breadth and depth of the issues with corruption. He had experienced a magnitude of corruption which is not unusual. It's quite common in Karachi, but it represents the way in which he describes it, represents the depth and the complexity of this corruption in the education system. He says, "Sir, I couldn't study further because my other class fellows make us do their own papers, their exams, and sometimes they threaten us with a gun, so we have to do their paper. Our principal overcharges us, and when we sit to take the exam, an admit card is necessary to sit in the exam. So when we go to school to collect admit cards, the teacher asks us for money, although they should give it for free, but they take 500 rupees for each admit card, and if we don't give it to them, our submission date would run out and we wouldn't be able to take the examination." And he actually continues further, and if you'll permit me, I'll read you a little bit more because I find his voice so powerful. He says, "When we are done with our papers, the results must come. And in the results, it is shown on the internet that this is your percentage. So we can check our percentage there. But when we go to study further, we need a mark sheet. If we go to the school and say to our teacher that we want our mark sheet in order to get admission to college, the teacher would say, we take 1,500 rupees, but you can give me 1,200 and take your mark sheet. We take 2,000 rupees for provisional certificates, but for you, you can give us 1,500. I said to him, "Sir, you are asking too much, and my father's pay is not much, and I have other brothers, and they are working, and they work all night long." And then he started crying. He broke down in the interview. I also put this photo in the corner on this slide to illustrate the prevalence of political parties in high schools in Pakistan, and particularly in Karachi. They do recruit in high schools, and they are reported to provide protection to students who join. And they are also prevalent at universities and on university campuses. People don't call them gangs, but we might think of them as operating in some ways similar to gangs and in other ways different from gangs. So what are Elizabeth and I doing with all of these quotes and all of this data? We are calling at this point for an agenda for hope. And we base this on a previous agenda that was put forward by a previous Secretary General of the UN, Boutros Boutros-Ghali. He called for an agenda for peace building. And we reference this agenda for peace building, and we think it's important in the context of our work, because setting forth an agenda for peace building, making peace building a thing to study, and making it something from which one looks critically and engages, with which one engages critically, we think is important for hope as well. We'd like to see this happen to hope, to engage critically with hope so we understand better. We break down these relationships. We think about it in a constructive way. We think about all of the interactions as mechanisms to analyze. Peace building, an agenda for peace building, allowed policymakers to think systematically about peace building interventions, and it spawned a field of study. We hope that this will help prompt systematic thinking about hope and perhaps spawn a field of study. We do think that there's movement towards a field of study of hope and optimism as well. We also would like to present some steps toward this agenda for hope that would include understanding better the durability of hope. What happens when hopes are dashed? How long do those dashed hopes last? How do people recover from dashed hopes? And if one's hopes are dashed from education, does that have somehow more severe consequences? Are the consequences different than being dashed from something else? We are currently working towards a measure of hope, which I'll describe in just a minute. We need to be able to define hope more clearly and measure it cross-nationally, cross-culturally. We are very interested in the effects of educational access on hope, and we are currently engaged in testing this question systematically. So that sets me up perfectly for talking about our current study, which is called Tracking Hope in Nairobi and Karachi. THINK for short. We love the acronym. We're very proud of it. I also mentioned our co-authors here, Daphne Harrell and Jennifer Hill, who are statisticians in our department at NYU and are also just have been tremendously important and critical for the second stage of the study, of our multi-year project that I mentioned. So this is the second stage. The current study, in the current study, we ask what are the effects of access to university education on hope and on attitudes and behaviors related to peace and conflict. We are systematically studying those who get access and don't get access to tertiary education. We're doing this through a regression discontinuity design, which I'll speak about in a moment, in both Karachi, Pakistan, and Nairobi, Kenya. And we have local partners, I want to add and emphasize, in both countries. Local partners we work with closely, who are also instrumental. I didn't actually mention them here, but in Karachi we work very closely with the Institute of Business Administration, and our partner in Pakistan, which is where I'm based when I'm in Pakistan, is called the Center for Economic Research in Pakistan. Similarly, Elizabeth works with a local organization in Kenya called WORK, which stands for Women Educational Researchers in Kenya. This new research design includes a rigorous quantitative study. It's a regression discontinuity design, as I just mentioned, and I'll show you an example of what those types of designs look like. It's a systematic study of those who just pass to gain access to the first year of university versus those who just missed that access to university. It's a panel survey. We have had enormous challenges in baseline sampling, tracking, and measurement, which we'll be happy to speak to you about if you're interested. But we're thrilled with where we are in the study, and we have been able to move forward very successfully in both cities with very large sample sizes, I would say, in both cities, around 5,000 in Nairobi, and a larger sample size in Karachi, partly because we have had to capture more students to get at this margin that we're interested in specifically targeting. So a regression discontinuity design looks like this. One aims to capture those who are clustered around as I said, just above the line that passes and just below the line. The assumption being, I should also mention the assumption is that those youth who are grouped on either side of that cutoff are statistically similar in almost every way, which is why regression discontinuity designs are so interesting and appealing. We have conducted baseline and midline. We gathered demographic information. We gathered a lot of responses to our survey questions on our measure of hope, which includes aspirations, expectations, a locus of control, agency questions. We also modified the commonly used measure of hope that one finds in Western English-speaking contexts. We have measured peace, conflict, conducive micro-level attitudes and behaviors, and we're considering for the end line, we're around the corner, we're going to be conducting the end line in Karachi. One of the things we're considering including eventually in both places is also the possibility of behavioral games. We're very interested in that. So our next steps include the end line in Karachi with one of our universities. The design has been slightly different in both cities, but we've kept the instruments the same, and we work very closely together. So every stage, every point at which we make our decisions, we consult and we work together to make those decisions about the design and our methods. The end line will be in Nairobi in April next spring, and we hope to extend the study longitudinally, certainly longitudinally. So we're hopeful on that point. At the moment, we'll have about two years of data collection. Oh, finally, I guess you could call this a commercial break also. This is the end of my talk, but I did want to highlight that we also at NYU house the Journal on Education and Emergencies, and our next special issue actually is a featured issue, a special issue on education, political violence, and the war on drugs. So it should be something that's particularly interesting, and there's a lot of focus on Latin America, as you can imagine, and some of the articles actually will be written in Spanish, published in Spanish. Very exciting. I do encourage you, if you have an interest in sending anything our way, please do. We have a rigorous peer review process. The journal is also open access, which is really important to us. And we also publish field notes. We do podcasts with authors that have been enormously successful and appealing to our audience. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for hosting us. Thank you so much for listening. You've been very patient to listen to both of us speak, and we're really eager to hear your thoughts and comments. Thank you.
So now I would suggest like a 5-minute break, and then we can come back for the discussion. We're going to have two great No importa, ya terminé. Entonces, 5 minutos. Sí, gracias.
pues voy a iniciar en español y ya haré mis comentarios en inglés, solo para agradecerle a Juan la invitación. Estoy muy honrado de estar aquí con Elizabeth y Dana, y además con Sandra, que también es una colega que ha hecho un trabajo extraordinario en los últimos años sobre el tema de violencia en México. Entonces, yo además quiero decir en términos personales que estos son dos temas que me interesan y que no había hecho el proceso de hacer la intersección entre paz, violencia y educación. Entonces, esto es un buen momento para discutirlo, ya que viene el próximo gobierno. Entonces, voy a pasar al inglés. Thank you very much. The two presentations were very deeply interesting and made me think about a lot of stuff that we can speak. First of all, the topic about how this can be a good discussion and research agenda for the new policies the new government is going to deploy here in Mexico. For those who are here or watching us on the internet, the new government is going to make a massive scholarships program for youth in universities to reach them and to increase enrollment in tertiary school, and also to make a linkage between them to work or to school, or both. It's Jóvenes Construyendo el Futuro, Youth Building Future. So in the name has this topic that we were talking about, hope. López Obrador, the president-elect of Mexico, said this program has many objectives. In general, because the new government has the perspective to make a universal approach to education and the social programs, very different from the very narrow social policy that we have had in the last years, like Prospera, no? That it's a very narrow program directed to some people that follows the classic literature about poverty studies. Now he has a universal and social protection view of the country, and he's doing this sideline the peace-building process that we are launching. Yesterday, the president-elect received a document with recommendations from public forums he did in all of the country about the pacification process, hearing victims about violence, for example, homicides, forced disappearance in Mexico, displaced people by violence, and other kind of problems like gender violence and feminicide in Mexico that has been rising since 2007, when the Mexican government initiated an intensive war on drugs effort in those years. So it's interesting that these two things are happening, and I think that your two presentations give us a theoretical and practical way to move and discuss this and see how it works and evaluate it during these 6 years. The president has 6-year term, so we are going to see if what you say, how works in Mexico. Also, and the first thing I wanted to comment, it's the interesting thing, you to make research on civil war conflicts, or the classical civil war conflicts. And Mexico, we have a current discussion between researchers about the nature of a conflict. Uppsala program says that we have an internal conflict, no? Based on the number of the death rate. And that's how they solve the problem, no? By the Red Cross standards, they say we have some kind of internal conflict. But we have two kinds of argument here in Mexico. First is we are in a kind of civil war. And Andrea Schedler here in CIDE says that. And other professors say, well, Estatis Calibas said in a paper, well, you are not in a civil war because you don't have the classic characteristic of a civil war that it's based on ethnic and political motivations. It's more like an economic motivation and organized crime conflict. Recently, a professor from Chicago, I can't remember his name, Benjamin Lessing is making a new, thank you Sandra, a new classification of state cartel war dynamic. And well, we can discuss it further. But the interesting thing, it's a paper that you have cited of Hoffler and Anne Hanke that makes the connection between these two different type of literature about civil wars and economic motivations in civil wars. And we have to build on that because we don't have enough work, theoretical work, about what's the nature of conflict that is based on organized crime, drug-based conflict, that has transnational roots like the Mexican conflict, obviously because we are in a war that it's motivated by the restrictive policies of the United States government. So it's going to be interesting how we can apply what you have offered to us in this context, that it's, well, we have lived in El Salvador and, well, Guatemala and Honduras, that they are living a massive displacement of people that we are reaching the southern border. So we are going to see how we can make this. So the exciting time, academically speaking, not for the reality. For the reality, it's quite atrocious. It's that we have to build upon something that is new and it's happening right now. Well, second of all, from the four relations between violence, peace, and education that presented us Elizabeth, I want to make some comments. In general, I agree, and only I would say I would add from the sociology of education and sociology of crime literature, because I perceive, generally speaking, that the experts from all these fields, or economics of organized crime, for example, the experts on civil wars and conflict, the sociology experts on education, and the sociology experts on the violence or crime, they don't talk between them very often. And the base of my commentary, the general commentary I want to say is, we have to build that discussion between fields, because we are talking about things that the other field of knowledge can bring us perspective, variables, theories, or causal relationships that could make stronger theories or stronger empirical evidence in the future. First of all, the relation between, well, how violence affects education. It's interesting. In Mexico has been few studies, but very strong studies about how violence affects academic achievement. There's, I think, 2 papers. I don't remember the authors. Sorry, but I could bring you by an email that uses the Enlace test. That was a test that it's not longer do it. That makes studies about achievement in schools, and they found the relationship between homicide rates and academic achievement going down. So it's quite interesting also in the field of evaluation education that they are disrupting not only the normal life, they're disrupting learning processes that are fundamental. So, and also, in this discussion about education, and something that Elizabeth said, and we have to deal with further, and I say we have because all the people that we want to make the study is the endogeneity problem in research that we have. This is violence is causing this, or it's previous to that, and we have to to face that challenge in the future. I would say in Mexico, Atenea Rosado, it's a graduate from Colombia, had a master thesis that it's very interesting, that she spoke about the experience of teachers and how they live conflict in this context. It's very interesting that you commented about the Rwanda case, and that they're involved in the genocide dynamics. In this case, it's teachers that are normal teachers, based and trained by the Mexican state, by the normal rural system, or the normal system in general. They have to face these new crime dynamics in the regions, and how even teachers can be felt threat if their students are involved in gangs or criminal organizations. So that's an interesting topic that we should also speak about, because if we think of teachers like peace builders, like they are going to create conscience in the terms of the UNESCO Charter, and also we had to think, what are the teachers' conditions to make this peace process? And because in education, we have this problem that it's not the same enrollment as achievement as effective learning about things. And that's a process that we have to reach on, because if we go deeper in this study, we are going to find that in some cases, we are measuring enrollment and not the same as learning. In this case, like education for peace programs and other things. So it's necessary also to understand these processes, understand teachers in these stress settlements. For example, in Mexico, it's Michoacán and Guerrero, for example. In Guerrero, they have a special settlement that in Guerrero, Normales Rurales, it's the school state-based system for the formation of teachers. They are strongly involved in left-wing organizations, far left-wing organization. The famous Normal Rural of Ayotzinapa is part of a federation of communist students here in Mexico. So this creates in different areas challenges, fascinating challenges about how teachers and their philosophy of education affect how they teach. I'm not assuming anything. I'm not assuming that their formation in communism or left-leaning ideas it's making violent students. I'm not saying that. They address more like the Paulo Freire pedagogy philosophy, that education for liberty. So it's going to be interesting studying, especially anthropologically, the roles of teachers in schools in these peace-building processes now that we are living in Mexico. Well, the second of all, it's interesting about education and peace-building specifically, about the routine theory and the role of male. We can, in this, speak about two general theories that we can bring concepts and see how they work. The first is the routine theory in criminology. It also has vinculation to the control theory in general. It's education, school-based education, not all education, but school-based institutionalized education has a control role. In sociology, it's very strong how they say, well, education gives credentials, gives socialization, and gives control and modernization, if we use the Norbert Elia approach. So from these perspectives, it's interesting to know if we are measuring enrollment as a control of society, so we are keeping young males in school, and those hours they are in school, they are not committing crimes outside, for example, or we are measuring how they get modernized, their thinking about social relations. So this is going to be interesting. Or the third one, it's credentialization theory of Randall Collins, and he says, well, people go to school because they need a credential for market job. So how it's the interaction in peace building, that what they want the students to reach out from violence. They want a credential so they can have a formal job and have an income and have upward social mobility perspectives, or they are getting culturalized in a non-violent, state-abiding, rule of law environment, or we are only controlling them, taking them to schools. So in that case, we have to have the discussion. I do not agree with critical theories, but we have to have the discussions with the critical theory about education. And these Foucaultian and Ivan Illich theories that they say, well, schools are prisons. I don't agree, but we have to discuss them, because in some kinds, we use them like, and a state can use them like a mechanism to keep them inside somewhere and not outside of school. Because the general theory is they are outside of school, they can catch them, they can recruit them, or they can, like the famous discussion that we have currently, that the ninis, no? The non-scholarized, non-working youth in Mexico. They are committing crimes? I think not, but well, that's a discussion that we have to have in Mexico. Because in the inmates data that we have from MPOL, that's a new poll that the National Statistics Office launched, most of inmates, well, I'm working on the data, but most inmates in the system, that it's biased because the justice system in Mexico is biased, they have secondary school rates, so they have like 5-6 years of formal enrolling. They don't go to what we understand like middle school or high school even. So it's going to be interesting to see what's the profile of the people that effectively commit violent crimes in these conflict settlements. So it's going to be interesting to see in this relation of peace building that we have to create and distinguish the effects of enrollment, credentiality, of effective learning, and how a school can be viewed also from the youth perspective as a prison. If you speak to a youngster, and sometimes even myself could say, well, I'm going to school because my parents wanted me to go to school. I understand that it depends on the context. In a normal context, youth sees as a parent's command. And that's like the social control theory in sociology. Your parents command you to go to school, so they hope that you are not out of the streets doing anything else and being productive. So we have to deal with this and create positive environments in schools. Also, an interesting thing about the second presentation that you have, it's how they see the others, well, these youngsters that were not school or dropped out of school, or they didn't continue to university. They say, well, my other friends didn't go to school, I want to go. And the important part, and I think that's the hoping thing that we can see in school, it's socialization. And in the classic Parsons perspective, that it's school serves so we can socialize, get friends, get networks, and from there, making our lives in the future. So, in general speaking, I want to say we have to understand school as part of the social system. I'm more eclectic views. You can use one of the theories or concepts, but we have to understand it in that context, in violence. Also think about socialization as a causal mechanism. The other is gender. I think it's important. Most of literature in all academic branches and disciplines, they all have the agreement. Young people, demographic growth of males creates homicide rates, violence. We have to build a causal mechanism of that. And we have to speak with gender theory about that. It's a building masculinity. And to ask us about how it's a school transforming masculinity in schools and masculinity based on violence perspective, or it's reinforcing it? I don't know. In Mexican school, we have very traditional schools when most of teachers would reinforce gender roles, for example. Men are strong and female are weak, no? So if you have your teacher saying that men are strong, your teacher is building peace there. So we have to also make that assessment and work on that. Because that's, in the critical theory, would say, well, that's a militaristic structure of schools. They are forming students in a military way, and men are getting the tough jobs, and women are going to have the taking care of works. Recently in Mexico, we reformed our curriculum. It's not yet finished implementation, but they recently incorporated emotional-based education. So it would be very interesting how does that develop? Because in Mexico we have the deep problem that we change curriculum, but the real curriculum happening in school doesn't change in reality because we make too much. So we could see how this approach of emotional perspective in our curriculum can make some changes in managing emotions and especially managing fear or anger, and how that builds masculine roles in schools. And also, we have this paradox that you say. I think a branch that we haven't spoken today, but it would be interesting is to talk about other systems of education. It's not mass education, it's military and police education. I have a colleague here in Mexico from UAM, it's Roberto Mercadillo. He's working on police academies about how they train their policemen. No, it's a broad view from neurocognitive schools, or they're saying where is the center of anger and how they manage. Because in Mexico we have the problem that former military men or former policemen, that they're usually young, they get involved in organized crime. So they have militaristic or police enrollment and education, and they get anger-based education, and they go to organized crime, and they usually get involved in the enrollment of youth, of masculine youth process. And, well, I would say many of the things I said, I'm going to finish. We have to understand also the role, well, the hope message of Guterres, of Obama, of UNESCO. They are thinking about an education that doesn't exist. They think of education of universal, that everyone can go to school. Some countries have those systems, but most educational systems are let me get the word straight, stratified by class, by gender, by occupational basis, and this stratification affects schools. So we have to understand how stratifications can help us or not, or obstaculizes how the peace-building capacities of schools. And you have pointed very well, and I think it's very interesting, for example, to understand different mechanisms of stratification. For example, test scores. You said, well, I had this test score, and this, what's the word, just dashed my hope, no? Achievement scores, evaluation, it's all a system that has been deployed around the world about how we evaluate and punish students and punish schools and punish teachers about their performance. And this system, dashing hope, it's on scale and produces stratification. So we have to understand also how many youth people, for example, in Mexico, doesn't get to university, and how the López Obrador, and that's my final comment, said we have to reach the universal tertiary school in some way. The tricky problem is implementation, but he says we have to take the barriers, that's the tests, so you can take schools. You could, for example, enroll to school without taking a test. And how could that take an effect in massive enrollment and inclusion and peace building process? We are going to see it, and I don't know how it's going to be implemented in Mexico, but it's quite interesting. So I'm fascinated. As you see, I have many other comments and I have little time, but I'm glad that we have this conversation today. Thank you.
Thank you. As I said, I'm fascinated by this project, and I already offered my RA services for April in Nairobi. It sounds fascinating. I really admire what you're doing, and really grateful to be able to be here. Thank you, Juan. And I think it's a great way for Raul and I to complement the comments for one another. So I want to say first that perhaps to make sense of where I'm coming from, I'm a political scientist, but has been working in organized crime and political behavior. So many of the comments come from that point of view, and hopefully they can be useful. I think it's great to have more objective assessment of education and its consequences, being able to assess its negative aspects. And as much as I'm also a believer in the power of education, I really admire and applaud how you're moving away from the usual idealization of education as in exclusive positive aspects. And it's crucial to problematize education and get a better sense of its limitations. So I thought both texts, well, all the texts that you sent were really powerful in that regard. And I think that in your new project, joint project, I think it's really hard to grasp such an intangible aspect such as hope. As you show in your first quotes, this concept, indeed shows up frequently in public discourse, and as Raul was saying, we've heard it from the incoming Mexican government too, but we rarely stop to understand what it means, how to get at it, and what it implies. So for students in the audience today, this is a true conceptualization and operationalization challenge. And I think you're doing it wonderfully, having this mixed methods approach, having such a rich set of qualitative data, plus going into the cutting edge research for quantitative methods. I think this is fascinating. I'm fascinated by the complex and interesting literature that you show on education and hope. And given such detailed information on how hope and education connect with one another, but perhaps most importantly, making sense of the meaning of hope in the context of education amid violence, referring to aspirations, expectations, notions of paths to social mobility, career and life paths of possibility of change. I think that this is truly fascinating, and to get that grasp of the concept, it's amazing, because we rarely see in the literature, at least in political science, that it's just far away from emotions and feelings. I think I find that fascinating. As someone who has studied political behavior, then I keep wondering about how are these perceptions and notions of hope built? I wonder if this is also drawing from the elite discourse, if this is coming from local leaders, if this is just coming from local dynamics. What you're referring to about going to the notion of the durability of hope, I think is extra interesting. Understanding what's more powerful, to have hope or to have those hopes dashed. I think that's a great avenue of research that needs to be dealt with. I guess the challenge is separating the effects of education from those from broader institutional context in which the educational system operates. So, for example, the extent to which schools is tied with violence and discrimination depends to a large extent on how such phenomena are occurring at the broader social and political settings. What we see in schools may be just a subset of what is happening outside of school. And Elizabeth said in her talk, this is just a microcosm of society. So do we set direct blame towards the education system, or how do we separate understanding the effects of education from some other local dynamics. And however, at the same time, it is likely that schools are the site where it all starts in the first place, right? So as kids, that's how we understand discrimination, and that's how we understand corruption, and that's how it all becomes ingrained in us. Still, at the same time, whether education can promote well-being after conflict may be a reflection of broader social efforts for reconstruction. So one of your texts, Elizabeth, you talk about how in the process of reconstruction, people were really, well, thinking about educational reform and all those things. So I'm wondering, again, is this something about the broader reconstruction spirit, or is this something about education per se? So how do we effectively isolate the effects of education from those of the broader political and social context? I think your proposal to see education as political spaces, that's a crucial part of making sense of this question that just kept going into my head as I was reading your work. As I said, I was telling you during the break, I think that the work that you're doing really speaks to the Mexican case today. And we're just beginning to make sense of how education and violence are connected today. As Raul was saying, up to now, we just have this, some few papers here and there that have come out, others that are in process. Mónica Caudillo and Florencia Torche have in the Journal of Sociology of Education. The group from Stanford, Brenda Jarillo, Beatriz Magaloni, Eder Franco, and Gustavo Robles have worked in the International Journal of Education Development, showing how violence is affecting children performance, increased absenteeism by both teachers and children. And I think that's as much as we know right now in terms of where we stand. We're very privileged to have PIPE here at CIDE with great work that Ivania de la Cruz, Ana Raza, and Itzel Cabrera are doing in terms of understanding what's going on in secondary schooling, right, and how violence is being connected in the classrooms. But there's a lot that we need to understand in that regard. We know that forced displacement has curtailed educational opportunities, but we don't know much about the experiences of those kids. I was talking to my students during the break, and while there might not be an ethnic cleavage that we're seeing here, we really don't know what happens when these kids that are orphaned go into these new schools and they might be discriminated about that status, or not having those networks locally to be able to know how to study, what kinds of local resources they have. That is something that we still need to understand what's going on. Schools aside of violence, that we know a little bit more. During my field work, as I was doing my dissertation, I talked to a lot of teachers who had been protesting in the streets against crime because they had been extorted by organized crime. How the government reacted was giving them panic buttons. And just as they don't work for journalists, they don't work for teachers, because the police would never show up, or when they showed up, they would be really late and someone had already been killed at school or kidnapped. One of the stories that stuck with me was one of the teachers telling me that in terms of the content that you were telling about, how content of education could be interrelated with education, it's in a different way, but one of the stories that stuck with me was one of the teachers who had been teaching on that day on careers and professions in like second grade. And she was called by the father of one of her students to have dinner at their house because he wanted to know why she had asked that question. Turned out that he was a hitman, and so there was no reason why she should be asking about what the parents were doing, and that put her at risk for asking the wrong questions, right? So, and it was just an innocent question about careers and professions at school and learning about that. So in that sense, yes, the schools are a new setting to reproduce violence with bullying and replication of extortion practices within the classroom. Many teachers referred how it's really hard to stop children now asking for extortion fees to go into their classrooms to their other classmates, right? So that's kind of a challenging experience for teachers. What do I do with that? How do I deal with that? How do we prepare teachers for that? We know, as Raul was saying, that young men in the ages 19 to 35 with no schooling in Mexico have been the main targets of violence. maybe related to costs, maybe related to forced recruitment. As Raul was saying, we really don't know much about those mechanisms. But we also have growing evidence of new forms in which women are engaging with organized crime. And that has nothing to do with femicide violence that we have seen before. It's a different kind of violence. On the positives, as you present your research, knowing the positive and negative relationship, or more optimistic and less hopeful relationship, there has been a strong commitment for the outgoing, in the beginning of this outgoing administration, a strong belief that education was a tool of crime prevention. And this led to the development of what we hope will be innovative preventive programs, but had weak evaluation and follow-up mechanisms. We really don't have a really good sense of what crime prevention looks like from the educational perspective. We don't know what kinds of educational programs are the ones that could or should be working. Our bet was on soccer and music programs. And perhaps there's a lot of hope and aspirations there, right? We're a soccer country, and it was about becoming this soccer figure in the future, right? Or becoming this big musician. So in that regard, that was seen as part of that aspirational aspect, that kids would stay in school and let's keep kids away from the streets as much as possible. That was the logic that was behind it. Not so much about conflict resolution. That hasn't been really part of crime prevention programs. So just trying to give people other options instead of staying out in the streets. But it got to the point in which it was pretty ridiculous, and we were giving kids glasses because kids that didn't see in school were dropping out of school because they couldn't see what their teachers were teaching, so they dropped out of school and they became criminals. It was a governmental program. So it reached a really ridiculous point in which we were really not knowing about what to do with education. So we know education is important, but we don't know about what about education is important. So I think your work will really help us illuminate that part in understanding what is it about education, not just, is it just going to school, or is it these other tools that Elizabeth was referring to about conflict resolution and other processes? I think we need greater evidence about what works for the specific context. As Raul was saying, it's hard to, sometimes we ask the question of, is this about civil war requiring certain tools for education, or is criminal violence different, right? Is this a different kind of context, and we need different kinds of solutions? Elizabeth, you talked about the diversity of conflict, so I guess that's where sometimes we don't know if the use of education tools the effects are generalizable, or are this for under different types of violence. And finally, a final point would be what Juan has been working more extensively about transitional justice. I think there's a big bet on how, from a social policy perspective, education is key here. But as I said, we have a weak reflection on how educational programs could be used in this process. In recent research that I'm conducting with Sarah Behrens from the University of Cologne and Melina Altamirano from Colegio Mexico, we find that victims demand more from the state, demanding more social programs, including education and health. But we find that non-victims want the state to play a smaller role, to get out of the picture and not provide more social services, because the state is a problem. And the state is the one that in part generated that violence. So if that's the case, we're in a conundrum about what to do with how social policy is going to be received and how is it going to be planned. We know that the Victims Commission has provided scholarships, but data on that is unavailable, it's not public, and it's not systematized. So we don't know what is being done, how those scholarships are being given, and what are the impacts of those scholarships. And I think that if in the framework of transitional justice we're going to talk about scholarships, we need to take it seriously and understand how those scholarships are being set up, specifically for those children that we really don't know about what's going on and how their lives are going after forced displacement or situation of orphanage. So as you can see, there's a lot for us to learn from your work, and we look forward to continuing this conversation and feedback. Thank you.
it would be nice to have another seminar and invite Froilán Enciso to talk about narco-culture. We have, well, in Mexico, we have to talk about it more profoundly and how narco-culture is also a factor for enrollment of youth or not. So that's the only thing I wanted to say, and it's great to have the comments of Sandra. Yeah.
Anybody has a question? I have one, but no? No? If he asks a question in Spanish.
Yeah, I think so.
Otherwise,
I think your presentation was very interesting. Thank you very much. I was wondering if you think, I know that this seminar is centered on the relation between education and violence, because one of the most important issues in education policy, even in Mexico now, is whether education reduces or not violence. But my question is, do you think that that is the most important variable for the reduction of violence? I mean, the Mexican government thinks now that that's the reason why his program, or his social program, is very rational. But don't you think that there are more important variables for the reduction of violence? And the second question is about the concept of hope that you used in your research, which is very interesting. But I don't know what were the standards that you used to measure hope. So what were the criteria that you used to know if in a discourse or in an interview someone was having hope or not? Thank you.
Bueno, mi pregunta era retomando un poco el comentario de la profesora Sandra Ley. And in short is, what a good academic program need to be effective decreasing violence? I mean, in order to design a policy, no? What it has to have to be effective.
Hello. It's more of a comment instead of a question, and it's regarding Mexico's situation with education. I think one of the main problems with education in Mexico is the perception we have about it, and how we don't have an educational system that just focuses on tradespeople in Mexico, and I think that's a big problem, right? We have the perception that in Mexico, when you study, is to be an engineer, is to be an office worker. And when you go to Canada, to the US, you also have institutions that teach you how to be a plumber, right? That teach you the right way to do the stuff. And then you see them have even better salaries than some engineers and stuff like that. In Mexico, I think that's one of the biggest problems. That's just a comment, and I think that's something that kind of shocks me about how Mexican education works and how we don't have those systems to regulate and have plumbers that are actually certificated. So, yeah.
So I have a question about the notion of hope that you use. You say in part of the presentation that you use this sort of dual understanding of hope, where one is a goal setting framework, and then the other one is that you take hope to be a sort of like an irrational, uncontrollable thing. And so, I guess my question was. It is an emotional. Yeah. But then, so my question there is, or maybe a suggestion or a question that I have is that, so actually so in my view, and coming from a very different field, political philosophy, that so emotions are not can be understood as being very rational, no? In the sense that you have to have an idea or a sort of like a construction, a rational construction about what you're reacting against in order for you to have to display an emotion. So this is like a cognitive view of emotions, right? And so I guess I was thinking that this sort of literature of cognitivism, the cognitive view of emotions, would actually be even more useful for your project, because the whole point. So when you talk about education as cultivating hope, I think you mean it in a sense, or this is what I got from the presentation and from the quotations that you have, that it's more that the education sort of like opens up new perspectives, and that gives hope to students, something along those lines. But it actually, my question was whether there was something in the curriculum that could actually create hope, but sort of like rationally, in the sense that by providing expectations, for instance, or just by developing attitudes. And that would be more like that would have nothing to do with opening up perspective, but it would actually, so working on attitudes, on patterns of thinking. But I don't know, just thought that that's sort of like a, so in short, it seemed to me that you were in that sentence, in that understanding of emotions, you were relying on a non-cognitive view of emotions, and actually having a cognitive view would perhaps be more would be useful.
Pero ¿alguna otra pregunta, comentario? Sí.
Thank you. I have a couple of questions. I'll be quick. The first one is, I know at the beginning of the presentation you said that you were focusing on education and schooling, but I keep thinking, was there any information about non-formal schooling? You know, NGOs, religious institutions, organizations that promote sports or art activities, and to what extent that is important for the students in your research. And then the second one, can you tell us a bit more about the opinions of students about the quality of the education they were receiving? Because, that we value school, we sometimes idealize what education can bring for us to our lives. But when you ask, well, what do you think about your teachers now and your courses now? I don't know if that helped you contrast, or was it consistent with this positive idea of education and hope? Thank you.
You want to respond? 2 minutes.
Yeah, well, yeah. How many minutes?
Something like 2.
Something like 2 minutes. Okay, so we'll go really quickly. I'll start in reverse order. So in Kenya and in Pakistan, I think this is a place where we saw differences in terms of the opinions of students about their quality of education. And we asked in both contexts in the qualitative work, what would you change if you were a minister of education? And in Kenya, most of the answers had to do with, we would make it less theoretical, we wouldn't make it all about memorization, we would make it more applied, which also speaks to the comment of our friend over here. And we saw quite different responses in Pakistan, and that reminds me that we also have to do a better job in this paper of looking both at the complementarities, but leveraging the comparison too, to see better about some of the differences. In terms of sports and arts and those kinds of things, obviously a much greater conversation, but what we see coming up in Kenya a lot, and I see a lot of UNICEF programming surrounding this, the idea of talent academies. So the idea that everyone has a talent and not everyone's talent is academic, and how can we think about harnessing these talents more broadly? And I think we're just at the very beginning of doing that. Tying that to our colleague over here, social standing and prestige came out so much in our research and could be an entire conversation about, identity and how education fits into your identity. But, studying to be an engineer, working in an office, is so much more highly regarded in terms of social standing than the trades. And we see the beginnings of initiatives in some of the countries that we're working to begin to think about how to change youth's opinions about the value of these different kinds of employment. And then responses like TVET programs. In response to the question, do you think education is the most important variable for the reduction of violence? I'd say, of course, we have to be careful about it not being a panacea. It cannot solve everything. We have security concerns, development concerns, economic concerns, justice concerns, reconciliation concerns. We're working on all those things at the same time. But we are doing education already. So it's not like your government's going to stop the education system. So this is a place where youth are going, and it's a place that has comparative leverage that it makes a lot of sense to invest in. And if you think about all the different areas with which schooling is related, you've got sort of one node that can get up to so much networked interaction that I think it's a really important place. And then to the answer of what does a good academic program need, and then I'm going to turn it over to Dana to do these in the first half maybe, I would say one of the things to think about is targeting. So the fact that we're focusing on youth and violence today, most youth are actually peaceful. So we need to think about the situations in which youth find themselves that make them choose less pro-social pathways, and to think about the differential needs that those youth may have. So maybe I'll stop there.
I might ask to look at, you wrote down the questions, I think. I might ask to just peek at them. Okay, I'm going to be very brief because I think Elizabeth already covered a lot of our responses. First, I just want to thank you all again. This was really terrific. The feedback from the discussants was absolutely fantastic, and your questions are all very perceptive and interesting. So a few quick responses to add to what Elizabeth has already said. Gender is a very important component. It came up in your comments, and it's also something we have included, but I realized we didn't really highlight it in any of our presentations today, although both of us do a lot of work on it. And we will pull out some of those differences in a little bit more detail. The question about the measure of hope in our qualitative interviews, again, that's something I don't think we highlighted sufficiently in our paper, and we should add and will add. We did code. We coded all of our interviews multiple times from both cities, and we coded for aspects of hope. So we hope to have captured these positive relations to hope and negative relations to hope systematically using Atlas TI, and in my case using Max QDA. I think at some point we've both used all of the various qualitative data software programs that you can find available, but those were two that we used in this particular study. That said, we might need to review some of that a little bit as we're continuing to work on this paper and develop it further. I think the point about what do youth really think, they idealize education, they talk about how important it is, but when you ask them how satisfied are you in your classes right now, are they really satisfied? Of course, many of them are not, and that did come through in our interviews as well. And I mean, in the case of Karachi, as Elizabeth pointed out, this question of equity just returned over and over and over in questions when I said, if you were Minister of Education in Pakistan, what would you do? Everyone except the most elite privileged students said we would make education equal, accessible to all, and free. And that also came through in their responses about the quality of education they thought they were getting and the interaction they had with corruption in the system. So I think we need to think about that a little bit further also in representing these findings. Non-formal education, why just look at or did we just look at education schooling? You know, actually we had some slight differences in the qualitative data and gathering it. In my case in Karachi, I looked at in-school and out-of-school youth, and then among the schools, those kids who were in school, I included madrasas, which is very challenging to do in Karachi, actually, because it's quite a sensitive topic. So it gets at some of these questions around I guess, that you're pointing to about informal education, but I guess these madrasas were a bit more formal than probably what you have in mind. We also included interviews with representatives of non-governmental organizations who are launching all of these programs for youth. Many of them did include informal programs, so we know quite a bit about that from the organizational perspective, but less so from the youth perspective from these particular data. Okay, I think I will just mention one more. I want to underscore one more point, that when youth talked about prestige and education as part of their identities, they also underscored in both places the concept, their reach for education, the importance education served in their lives as an antidote to humiliations, to social humiliations. So they felt that it was very, it was crucial for their interaction with people who would otherwise perceive themselves as better than, in a higher social standing, higher social place. Okay, I think I'll stop there. Thank you. Thank you so much. I guess we both would like to add that we hope this is the start of our conversation, and we welcome any emails and additional questions. We would love to continue the conversation. Thank you so much.
Well, yeah, thank you, and thank you to the commentators. It was a great seminar. So, yeah, let's hope we'll see you soon.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you.